On a humid August night in 1978, New York's streets swallowed a secret that would take 46 years to surface. Rain trickled down rusted fire escapes, pooling in the cracks of Bleecker Street. Neon lights buzzed and flickered like dying stars, painting the pavement in ghostly shades of blue and red. Somewhere between the sound of the city breathing and the silence it kept, someone vanished. It was 3 a.m. when a municipal worker stumbled upon what he first thought was a pile of discarded clothes in the alley behind a shuttered cafe. But when the flickering glow of his flashlight caught the pale outline of a hand, the night changed forever. There she was, Nora Kowalski, 19 years old, a student, an artist, a girl with dreams big enough to fill the entire city. Her hair, a vivid red, splayed across the cold ground like a warning flare. Her dark velvet dress was torn, her satchel discarded nearby, her beloved camera gone. And in her hand, something strange, something deliberate, a single brass cufflink, crushed between her fingers, engraved with the head of a lion, a symbol of wealth, of power, of ownership. Police arrived, sealing the alley with yellow tape that fluttered like frightened wings. Reporters called it another senseless New York tragedy. But it wasn't senseless. It was calculated. And it was only the beginning. Because what could possibly connect a 19-year-old photography student to one of Manhattan's most powerful families? Have you ever walked home late at night, feeling like the city itself was watching? The hum of the streetlights, the echo of your own footsteps behind you, the thought that maybe someone else is matching your rhythm? If this happened in your neighborhood, would you still feel safe? She thought danger looked like a shadow in an alley. She was wrong. Monsters can wear silk and gold. Subscribe now because the next story like this might unfold closer to you than you think. New York, 1978. Before tragedy turned her into a headline, she was just Nora Kowalski, a 19-year-old who believed she could capture the soul of the city through a lens. Every morning, she'd sling her worn 35mm camera over her shoulder, step into the hum of Greenwich Village, and chase the light. Street vendors, poets, buskers, stray cats sleeping under stoops. Nora saw beauty where others saw noise. She called her photos urban confessions. Every shutter click was a small act of faith that truth still existed somewhere between shadow and sunlight. She wasn't wealthy. Her world was a fourth-floor apartment that smelled of coffee and paint thinner, shared with her older cousin, Elara Popescu, a woman who played the role of both friend and reluctant guardian. Elara had moved to the city years before, chasing theater dreams that never quite materialized. She waited tables by day, auditioned by night, and worried constantly about Nora's fearlessness. "Nora," she'd say, "the city doesn't love anyone, it just watches." Nora would laugh, adjust the focus ring on her lens, and reply, "Then I'll make it see me." It was that kind of confidence, bright, fragile, unstoppable, that made people remember her long after she was gone. When Nora wasn't in class at City College, she worked the evening shift at the Printed Page, a narrow bookstore tucked near Washington Square Park. It was the kind of place where the floorboards groaned like tired lungs, and dust floated like whispers. She liked the quiet there, the rhythm of turning pages, the way strangers became stories. That's where she met Felix Alston, a jazz club bartender from the Lower East Side, with a crooked grin and the permanent scent of smoke on his hands. He wasn't the love of your life type, he was the now type. They'd walk home together after his shift, talking about films and philosophy until sunrise. Their romance was young and unfinished, plans half-made, promises still fresh. He'd bring her cassette tapes of Miles Davis. She'd leave him Polaroids of empty sidewalks, with handwritten notes on the back. "The city misses you." To anyone watching from the outside, Nora's life looked small. But inside it, inside that swirl of light leaks, vinyl records, and wild ideas, it felt infinite. Still, the city was changing. 1978 was a year of noise and danger. Muggings were routine. Sirens were part of the soundtrack. Even so, Nora walked with a kind of trust most New Yorkers had long abandoned. She believed the camera was her shield. If she could see the truth, it couldn't hurt her. On the night of August 12, the air was heavy enough to feel alive. Thunder growled somewhere above the skyline. Nora had plans. A midnight film screening with Felix at a revival theater on the east side. She wore a dark velvet dress, something she'd found in a thrift store, and called her Lucky Find. Alara teased her for dressing up for a movie. Nora just smiled, brushed a stray curl from her face, and said, "Every night's worth remembering." She left at 11:15 p.m., locking the apartment door behind her. Alara, half asleep, remembered the sound of her keys jingling down the stairwell, the faint hum of her humming an old Billie Holiday tune. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Hours later, at the edge of dawn, the city's rhythm slowed. Garbage trucks groaned through the empty streets, headlights slicing through mist. In one of those trucks sat Piotr Vasquez, a sanitation worker who'd seen his share of the city's cruelty. But that morning, when he turned into a narrow alley off Bleecker Street, something stopped him cold. A flash of color red hair against concrete. He jumped from the truck, heart racing, and found her there, still fragile. The world seemed to hold its breath. Within minutes, the alley filled with blue and red lights, the hum of police radios, the thump of boots on wet pavement. Reporters wouldn't arrive until later, but the story had already begun to write itself. Detective Silas Beck crouched beside her, studying the scene, with the calm detachment of a man who'd seen too much. But something about this one was different. The details felt deliberate. Her wallet still intact, the velvet fabric carefully torn, the satchel tossed, almost staged. And then he saw it. In her right hand, so tightly clutched that her knuckles had turned white, lay a brass cufflink pressed into her palm as if she'd fought to hold it. The engraved lion's head glimmered faintly in the rainlight. It didn't belong in this part of town. It belonged uptown, in penthouses and private clubs. Beck signaled for evidence collection, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't random, he murmured. She knew him. The alley became a stage of unanswered questions. Who was the man in the light-colored suit seen earlier that night near Nora's workplace? Why had no one heard a scream? As dawn broke, the city woke up, unaware that another name had been added to its endless ledger of mysteries. Commuters stepped over puddles. Street vendors opened shop. And somewhere, in a high-rise apartment far from Bleecker Street, a man buttoned his cuff and went about his morning. The police photographer's flash popped again and again, freezing the scene into permanence. The dress, the rain, the lion head gleam. Each flash was a heartbeat, each photo a moment refusing to fade. If you could freeze time at your happiest moment, would you? Would you keep it there, safe, untouched, perfect? Nora tried. She captured the city in frames of light and shadow, but the one moment she couldn't capture was the one that stole her life. And beneath those flickering streetlights, the story of the red-haired girl had just begun. The rain had washed the alley into a slick, reflective ribbon by the time Detectives Silas Beck and Victor Dubois arrived. They moved like men who had learned to weigh moments, the quiet ones that meant nothing and the ones that meant everything. Beck was the veteran, square jaw, slow-eyed, a patience carved from years of bad coffee and worse nights. Dubois was younger, quicker with a notebook, a man who still believed the city could be read like a ledger. Together they made the kind of team forged by routine and a stubborn refusal to let stories end badly. Beck crouched, his gloved hand hovering over the small, metallic object in the victim's palm. Under the damp streetlight, the cufflink looked out of place, ornate, heavy, and deliberate. The lion's mane was worked into brass with a kind of craft that suggested money and a taste for symbols. It sat there as if nailed to a timeline that didn't belong to this block. "This isn't a mugging," Beck said simply, the words low in the wet air. "This is something else." They photographed everything, the torn velvet, the satchel tossed like an afterthought, the small coins that lay undisturbed. The wallet was still in Nora's bag, cash untouched. Whoever had taken the camera had been selective. Whoever had done this had left a signature one that screamed of privilege rather than hunger. Dubois catalogued the cufflink. Lion's head, heavy brass, custom work. He read aloud into his recorder. Not common around here. They canvassed immediately. Booksellers, late-night barflies, students who'd been out for the same screening. A few offered statements. Most shrugged and closed doors. The village had always been a neighborhood of half-truths and private griefs. People looked away. That night, they looked away faster than usual. But there was one tip that landed like a stone on still water. Oswald Oz Finch, a taxi driver known for his memory and his habit of keeping to himself, called in anonymously the next morning. He claimed he'd seen an argument earlier that night. A young woman with red hair and a man in a light-colored leisure suit, the kind college boys wore when they thought they owned the place, Oz said near the printed page. They had yelled. The man had appeared impatient, almost annoyed. He had left in a taxi. Beck filed the tip, then pushed. He tried to coax Oz into coming forward publicly. The taxi driver hemmed and hawed, voice thick with caution. The city teaches people to be careful, Beck knew. It also teaches them how to survive. Finch's fear of testifying was a reality. The detectives could record his statement privately, but without testimony in open court. An anonymous tip had the weight of a whisper. Detectives followed every available lead. The bookstore's ledger, Felix's work schedule, Elara's account of the night. They tracked shoe prints, interviewed neighbors, checked nearby cameras, primitive by modern standards, but useful for angles and times. Yet the cufflink remained the oddest piece. Where did a heavy lion-headed cufflink wind up in a bleaker street alley, if not by design? Who wore such a thing in this part of town? The lead about a small Fifth Avenue jeweler, one that had closed years before, gave Beck hope. A local metalsmith recognized the alloy as a particular copper-zinc blend used by that shop. The ledger from that jeweler, when Beck managed to pry it loose from an estate sale, showed sales recorded by hand. A series of custom pieces purchased for a Vandermolen. A name. A family with roots planted deep into Manhattan soil. Wealth recorded in looping cursive on yellowed pages. But a name on a ledger is not an arrest. It is a scent. It is a suspicion that must be chased around city blocks and through the slippery corridors of influence. The detectives ran the cufflink through pawnshops and small jewelers, shouted descriptions into phone lines, and placed calls to the clubs and private men's rooms that dotted the island uptown. The trail flickered and dimmed like a failing bulb. People with money had options. They left town. They claimed alibis. They hired lawyers whose voices could drown out questions. Rumors ran fast through the village. The lionhead cufflink became something half-legend, whispered over coffee at 3 a.m., in diners, and discussed behind lowered bookstore counters. Who could it be? A student with taste? A visiting businessman? Some wealthy man who came down to see the city and left lighter when he did? The alley where Nora had been found began to acquire a new name. Students and late-night strollers started calling it the Ghost Alley. They meant it to be joking and serious at once. Nora's face, once a Polaroid taken and pinned to a fridge, moved into that strange space between rumor and ritual. For Beck, the case lodged under his skin. He was a cop who believed objects told the truth if you could coax them into speaking. He held on to the cufflink like a compass that pointed to something Beck could not yet name. He was convinced that whoever owned that cufflink had access to places where people with means mingled, to private clubs and closed rooms where the disadvantaged rarely tread. The idea that this might be a transgression of power, rather than a random act of violence, nagged at him. But the city has a practical hunger for the new and the urgent. Other crimes demanded attention. Political scandals bubbled in the papers. Crime waves gave precincts less time for old ghosts. Evidence sat in lockers. Witness recollections frayed at the edges. Oz Finch, who had seen and remembered, grew silent on the record. The jeweler's ledger was only a ledger. The fingerprint lifts on the satchel were partial enough to hint at a hand, not enough to identify a life. As the months slid into years, the lead chasing hardened into routine. The Times ran a story that framed the event as part of the village's darker nights, another incident among many. Public interest cooled. The detectives kept the case file alive in drawers and under lamps, but the city's appetite for closure had migrated. Nora's photograph, clipped from an old police blotter, yellowed at the edges. Those who knew Nora best did not let her fade. Ilara's visits to headquarters became ritual. She brought photographs. She argued with detectives who promised more than they delivered. Felix left the city and lived elsewhere, the ache of unfulfilled plans a constant companion. Beck visited the alley on significant dates, leaving lilies or simply standing for a moment, hands in pockets, watching the city continue to right itself around the gap Nora left. In the village, a small, persistent hum of memory kept the story alive. Students swapped the tale of the red-haired photographer like a campfire story, an urban parable about vulnerability and the price of curiosity. It was told and retold until Nora's real voice risked being flattened into a cautionary anecdote. Yet the cufflink remained its image recirculated in coffee shop conversations, in the margins of zines, and among the worn pages of case files. Time, however, is both a friend and a thief. The longer a case sat unsolved, the more it became part of the city's particular mythology. Nora's name settled into that slow orbit, reserved for the unresolved. People began to refer to her less as a person and more as a place marker, the ghost of Bleecker Street. The phrase was cold and poetic, and it carried the weight of a neighborhood's refusal to forget by pretending it had. Detective Beck refused to pretend. He left no stone unturned until the stones themselves became relics of an era that had moved on. He knew, with a stubborn clarity, that both comforted and tormented him, that some clues slept until science woke them. He taped the cufflink into a small evidence envelope, dated his notes, and slid the file into a case drawer labeled, in penmanship that was beginning to tremble, Unsolved, 1978. He told no one that he would visit the alley again on the anniversary every year, leaving a small token, watching for the day a new piece would fall into his hands. The city, meanwhile, walked on. Neon signs flickered. New music played from new clubs. But in the quiet corners, when the night felt thin and the rain made the pavement reflective as a mirror, people would think of the red hair in the gutter and ask, half to themselves, whether the streets truly forget, or whether they keep memory like a ledger, one line at a time, until someone reads it. Do you believe the city forgets? Or does it remember everything? The years that followed Nora Kowalski's murder stretched out like an unfinished sentence. 1978 became 1980, then 1990, then 2000. Each decade layering dust over the truth. Each new year pushing her memory a little further from the front page and deeper into the city's collective subconscious. The city itself changed faster than people could keep up. Bleecker Street's neon lights dimmed, artists were replaced by boutiques, and the alleys, once filled with whispers, became polished corridors for tourists. But beneath the surface sheen, the same pulse remained a quiet reminder that history never really disappears. It just hides behind real estate signs and repainted brick. And somewhere inside the NYPD cold case storage, file number 78-243 labeled Kowalski N waited. Ilara Popescu never let the waiting become silence. Every year on the anniversary of Nora's death, she wrote another letter to the NYPD. Every year, the tone changed slightly. From hopeful to pleading, to furious, to quiet determination. She became a constant in a system that thrives on forgetting. Please, she wrote once in 1987, her handwriting unsteady from exhaustion. Someone knows something. Don't let her vanish twice. Sometimes, she called precincts directly, even when she knew the number by heart. The detectives changed, the case supervisors rotated, but she kept her vow. No one would close the door on Nora. The letters stacked like a second case file of their own, dozens of pages, neatly folded and filed away. To some officers, she was a nuisance. To others, she was a reminder of what justice looked like before bureaucracy took over. Ilara never left the city. She moved apartments, changed jobs, watched friends grow old and leave. But every August, she returned to that alley. She'd light a small candle, say a name the city had buried under noise, and whisper, "You're not forgotten." Detective Silas Beck never left it behind either. Retirement didn't dull the edges of the case, it only made them sharper. By the late 1980s, Beck's hair had thinned and his gait had slowed, but his mind remained tethered to the same image, a brass cufflink, lion-headed, clutched in the hand of a girl who had fought back. Every year on the anniversary, Beck took the same quiet pilgrimage. He'd walk the few blocks from his apartment, stop at the edge of that Bleecker Street alley, and place a white lily by the wall. No press, no speech. Just a man and the memory of a promise he hadn't kept. Neighbors whispered that he looked haunted, but Beck didn't mind. He had long stopped caring what people thought. His life after the badge had been one of slow obsessions, side work as a private investigator, consulting gigs, and nights spent reviewing old reports under the dim light of his kitchen lamp. He reread his own notes from 1978. So many times the ink had begun to fade. He'd whisper to the cufflink sealed in its evidence envelope like it could hear him. "You'll talk someday." The brass had dulled, but the lion's face remained fierce, an echo of arrogance and entitlement, frozen in metal. Beck saw that lion in every polished banker who hurried past him, every boardroom portrait of a man who thought himself untouchable. For him, the cufflink wasn't just evidence. It was proof that monsters can live among the respectable. Then came the 1990s, the decade of breakthroughs that weren't enough. DNA testing had become the shiny new promise in law enforcement. But for the Kowalski case, it was too little, too late. The samples from the velvet dress were too degraded, the trace evidence too faint. The cufflink's blood sample, though faintly preserved, yielded nothing coherent under the technology of the time. "Try again," Beck urged one of his contacts in the lab during a 1995 review. Science catches up. It always does. They tried and failed. The 2000. It's brought even more advanced systems, digital fingerprint archives, cross-jurisdictional DNA databases, yet Nora's case remained an asterisk in the ledger of unsolved homicides. Every new forensic advance offered hope, then frustration. There were moments of movement, brief reviews, re-examinations, even whispers of renewed interest when the cold case unit expanded in 2008. But every attempt ended the same way, inconclusive. Meanwhile, Beck aged. His walks became shorter, his handwriting shakier, but the lilies still appeared in the alley, year after year. Locals who noticed called it the detective's ritual. They didn't know the man's name, but they knew his devotion. Time reshapes tragedy. By the 2010s, the story of Nora Kowalski had become a ghost legend, part cautionary tale, part urban myth. Online forums carried threads titled "The Girl with the Lion's Cufflink." New York historians referenced her in documentaries about the dangers of the old city. A few amateur sleuths dug into it, posting grainy scans of newspaper clippings and speculating about the missing camera, the possible suspects, the jewelry connection. Elara saw those posts sometimes. She never commented. She just read in silence, sometimes shaking her head at the way strangers turned her cousin's life into puzzle pieces. To her, it wasn't mystery. It was memory. Through all of it, the cufflink waited. Inside its plastic evidence bag, it sat in a climate-controlled cabinet under lock and key, labeled in neat handwriting, item #7, brass cufflink, lion's head, partial blood residue. Technicians rotated, supervisors retired. Shelves were reorganized, but the cufflink stayed. Its alloy, once polished and proud, had grown dull and mottled. Yet it was still beautiful in its cruelty. A trinket that had once pinned down a cuff on a silk sleeve now served as the silent witness to its owner's crime. Every story leaves a heartbeat behind. And for Nora's case, it was that small piece of brass. By the early 2020s, the people who remembered the case could be counted on one hand. Elara, gray-haired but unyielding. Felix, now living quietly out of state, who still sent flowers every year with no note. And Beck, older than the file itself, his eyesight failing, but his mind still sharp enough to trace every step he'd ever taken. One evening in 2021, a reporter from a small true crime podcast found him in a diner, nursing black coffee. She asked if he ever regretted the obsession. Beck smiled faintly and said, "You don't regret promises. You just live long enough to see if they keep themselves." She asked if he thought the case would ever be solved. Beck looked toward the window, where the city lights flickered like camera flashes, and answered, "It's sleeping, not dead. The truth doesn't die. It just waits for someone with better tools." That line made it into the podcast's closing narration, earning a quiet resurgence of interest in Nora's case. Online, the story picked up momentum again. Armchair detectives, trading theories, comparing maps, speculating about the cufflink's origin. Still, it remained unsolved. Dust settling on stacked file boxes labeled "cold cases, unsolved." A police storage vault closing under fluorescent light. The city skyline shifting from gray towers to glass monoliths. A wilted lily on cracked pavement. Time kept passing, as time always does. But beneath the noise of progress, justice was still breathing shallow, but alive. For 46 years, no one knew a killer walked freely among them, admired, respected, untouchable. If truth can hide that long, how many secrets are buried where you live? Subscribe. Stay aware. Stay one step ahead. Beck's final visit to Bleecker Street came in 2023. He walked slower than before, his cane tapping softly against the concrete. He placed the lily in the same spot, looked up at the brick wall that had watched everything, and whispered, "Next year, you'll speak." And for once, it felt less like hope and more like certainty. Because in a quiet laboratory across state lines, under a microscope built for the future, the lion's head was about to open its mouth. 46 years after Nora Kowalski's death, the New York City Cold Case Unit reopened its doors to a new kind of investigation, one guided not by instinct or witness memory, but by science. In early 2023, Lieutenant Quinlan Vesper stood in front of a wall of forgotten faces. Rows of case photos, black and white victims of every decade stared back at her. She was young for her rank, barely in her 30s, sharp-minded and relentless. Where others saw files too old to solve, Vesper saw unfinished conversations. She had a simple philosophy: technology doesn't forget. Under her command, the Cold Case Unit was restructured, rejuvenated, and rearmed with cutting-edge tools. Vesper had studied the failures of the past, the limits of earlier DNA tests, the contamination risks, the incomplete matches. But she also knew that the next generation of forensic technology had rewritten what was possible. In that fluorescent-lit office, she pointed to Nora Kowalski's photograph, pinned at eye level. "Run it again," she said to her team. "Everything. Every fiber, every cell, every fragment. This one's been waiting long enough." Inside the forensics lab, history met the future. Technicians in white coats carefully unpacked sealed evidence: the preserved fibers from Nora's velvet dress, the trace skin cells found under her fingernails, and most importantly, the brass lion head cufflink. It had sat dormant for decades, holding inside it a microscopic story no one had yet read. This time, it wouldn't be analyzed through the old DNA kits of the 1990s. This time, it would face the precision of forensic-grade genome sequencing, or FGGS, an advanced process capable of mapping out entire genomes from even the most degraded material. The samples were prepped, processed, and fed into machines that hummed softly, blinking with sterile light. Each strand of data stretched across digital screens like constellations, tiny fragments aligning to form a pattern. In the silence of that lab, years of uncertainty began to unravel one molecule at a time. When the results came back, the air in the room shifted. The DNA extracted from the cufflink and from the cells under Nora's fingernails revealed a near-complete genetic profile, something that had never been possible before. Vesper's team uploaded the sequence into a genealogical database, a public platform used by law enforcement across the country to find familial links through voluntary DNA uploads. It was a process that had cracked open countless long-buried cases. The system began its digital search, comparing patterns, searching for distant echoes of biological connection. Hours passed. Then a notification appeared on the monitor. Match found. The hit wasn't the killer himself, it was a third cousin once removed, a man named Orion Costa, living quietly in Connecticut, a retired math teacher. A man with no record, no reason to be connected to Nora Kowalski or anyone in New York in 1978. But DNA is a storyteller that skips generations. Through Orion's family line, investigators began to build a genetic family tree, mapping out ancestors and descendants, cross-referencing census records, birth certificates, and marriage archives. Slowly, the branches converged toward a single powerful lineage, one whose roots had long been entangled with Manhattan's wealth and real estate. The Vandermolen family. A dynasty. A name whispered in the city's social pages for over a century. And at the center of that web, one man stood out. August Vandermolen. On paper, August was a pillar of New York's upper class, a retired real estate mogul, philanthropist, and art benefactor. His name appeared on museum plaques, university endowments, and charity galas. He'd been called a man of legacy. But in 1978, he had been something else entirely. A privileged 1-year-old law student at Columbia, known for his arrogance, his charm, and his family's reach. Vesper stared at his old yearbook photo, the confident smirk frozen beneath neatly parted hair. She read his file again and again, letting the pieces fall into place. The family's ownership of the building beside the alley where Nora had been found. The expensive fashion tastes, the leisure suit, the access, the arrogance. She looked up from her notes and said quietly to her team, "He never thought anyone would look this deep." The cufflink had once belonged to him. The lion head wasn't just a decorative design, it was the Vandermolen family crest, forged by a Fifth Avenue jeweler who had closed its doors 4 decades earlier. Vesper's analysts found the proof in old ledgers retrieved from the jeweler's archived estate. There it was, written in pen and ink. June 1978. Commission, custom set, lion head brass cufflinks. Client, A. Vandermolen. For Beck, the discovery would have been vindication. For Vesper, it was the start of something far more dangerous, a collision between truth and influence. The team moved quietly. They knew one wrong leak could collapse everything. A surveillance unit was deployed. Vesper herself attended to the details, studying August's current routines, his charitable appearances, his morning walks along the Hudson, his glass of wine at the same penthouse window every evening. She needed one thing, his DNA, collected cleanly, indisputably. Weeks passed before the opportunity presented itself. At a black tie fundraiser in Midtown, August Vandermolen raised a toast to the strength and spirit of New York. When the gala ended, he set his half-empty champagne glass on a tray and left without notice. Vesper's team retrieved the glass. Hours later, it sat in a sterile container under ultraviolet light. A technician swabbed the rim and fed the sample into the sequencer. The results came back fast. The machine displayed a message that turned 46 years of silence into sound. Match confirmed. 100%. The DNA from the cufflink and Nora's fingernails belonged to August Vandermolen. Lieutenant Vesper exhaled slowly, staring at the printout. Around her, the room was quiet. No one spoke. The truth had finally surfaced not because of confession or conscience, but because of science. And in that sterile laboratory, under the hum of machines, one thought repeated itself like a pulse. Science had found what power buried. Would you want your DNA to unlock a murder secret in your family? Because for one man, his bloodline just unlocked everything he'd spent a lifetime hiding. Morning sunlight filtered through the haze over lower Manhattan, glinting off the polished glass towers of Tribeca. The Hudson shimmered in the distance, calm and oblivious, while the city below braced for the quiet chaos about to unfold. Inside a penthouse overlooking the skyline, August Vandermolen stirred his coffee and opened the newspaper. He was 67 now, hair silver, back slightly curved, movements deliberate. Around him, every detail screamed legacy. marble floors, curated art, walls lined with awards and philanthropic citations. It looked like success. It looked like virtue. At exactly 7 a.m., the elevator dinged softly. 4 NYPD officers stepped out, led by Lieutenant Quinlan Vesper. She moved with the calm precision of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. When the door opened, August didn't flinch. He looked at the badge, then at Vesper, and gave a faint nod like he had known this morning would come, and had made his peace with it. "Mr. Vandermolen," Vesper said evenly, "you're under arrest for the murder of Nora Kowalski." He didn't ask who that was. He didn't pretend confusion. He simply set his coffee cup down, straightened his robe, and whispered, "It took you long enough." By noon, New York was roaring. Every major network had broken the story simultaneously. Respected philanthropist, arrested in 1-1978, murder of art student. Vandermolen dynasty, shattered by cold case breakthrough. Helicopters hovered over Tribeca. Photographers crowded police barricades. The man who once sat at charity galas beside mayors and museum directors now sat behind reinforced glass, his wrists clasped in steel. The image hit the city like a thunderclap. How could someone so admired, so trusted, harbor something so monstrous? In the newsroom of the New York Ledger, headlines were rewritten by the hour. Reporters scrambled for quotes, colleagues recycled old photos, and the city's social elite went into lockdown. A board member from the Metropolitan Arts Council told a journalist, "This can't be real. August was generous, brilliant. He helped fund children's hospitals." A lawyer friend, pale with disbelief, muttered, "DNA's wrong sometimes. There must be a mistake." Others weren't so forgiving. The undercurrent of resentment, decades of whispers about privilege and power, rose to the surface. Social media exploded with fury. Comments flooded in by the thousands. "This is what money hides. 46 years and no one looked at him? Nora deserves justice." Across the city, Elara Popescu sat in her modest apartment, the same one she had lived in for decades. The morning news anchor's voice trembled as they read the headline aloud. When the reporter asked for her reaction, Elara's face filled the screen, aged, lined, but fierce. Her voice carried the weight of every unanswered year. "He lived a full, rich life. My Nora got 19 years. I want the world to look at his face. And remember, monsters don't always wear ski masks. Sometimes they wear custom cufflinks." The clip went viral within hours, shared millions of times. It became the defining soundbite of the case. Her words cracked through the polished facade of New York's elite, exposing the rot underneath. Meanwhile, at his small Brooklyn apartment, Silas Beck watched the news from an old recliner. His health had faded, but his eyes still held their edge. When the anchor displayed the cufflink photo beside August Vandermolen's mugshot, Beck exhaled a long, trembling breath that sounded halfway between satisfaction and sorrow. "That cufflink," he said quietly to the television. She held on to him. She knew. Nora left the truth right there, and we just couldn't see it yet. A tear welled, but Beck didn't wipe it away. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen, whispering, "She won." For him, the case wasn't about redemption. It was about completion, a circle finally closing after decades of pursuit. As August was led out of a black transport van in handcuffs, the crowd erupted. Some shouted insults. Others, disbelief. Cameras snapped, reporters screamed questions, and his expression remained eerily calm. "Do you deny the charges? Why did you do it? Was it planned?" August turned once, meeting the sea of flashing lenses. "You all built me," he said coldly, voice almost drowned by the noise. "You loved what I represented, and now you'll destroy it." The words sent a ripple through the crowd, a strange mixture of arrogance and confession. Inside, Vesper watched from the hallway, arms folded. To her, this wasn't victory, it was inevitability. Justice doesn't celebrate, it just exhales. Newspaper presses running, ink staining pages with the headline, "Justice, 46 years delayed." News anchors debating privilege, accountability, and the power of modern science. commentators replaying Alara's quote on loop, her words becoming a rallying cry. Footage of Bleecker Street, now clean, bright, filled with tourists, intercut with old photos of Nora's camera and the cufflink under evidence lighting. The narrative had shifted from curiosity to confrontation. For decades, the city told itself that evil lived in shadows, in dark corners far from the circles of wealth and status. But this case shattered that illusion. Now, the question wasn't how August van der Molen killed Nora Kowalski. It was how he had managed to live freely among them for nearly half a century. In the weeks that followed, the city's upper echelons scrambled to distance themselves. Philanthropic boards removed his name from walls. Museum endowments were renamed. Invitations were rescinded. But those gestures came too late. The damage wasn't reputational, it was moral. For every person who had shaken his hand, attended his events, praised his generosity, there was the haunting realization that evil had never been somewhere else. It had been sitting beside them, smiling. Alara arrived at the courthouse carrying a faded photograph of Nora, one of her earliest prints from college. She stood silently as cameras surrounded her, the city's noise fading behind the flashbulbs. When asked what justice meant to her now, she said, softly, "Justice means remembering. That's all. Remembering until it hurts less." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't have to. And in another corner of the city, a nurse helped Silas Beck from his wheelchair to place a single white lily near the courthouse gates. He smiled faintly when he saw Alara's interview playing on a passerby's phone. "She was right," he murmured. "Monsters don't look like monsters. They look like us." That night, the story dominated global headlines. Editorials filled the airwaves. Podcasts dissected every second of the case. Viewers couldn't look away because beneath the crime was a mirror, reflecting what society chooses to ignore, that wealth and virtue can coexist with cruelty, and that justice, though slow, never forgets. He looked like everything right with society, but he was the nightmare beneath it. If you think evil is easy to spot, think again. Subscribe or stay blind to what hides behind smiles. By midnight, August van der Molen sat alone in a holding cell. The walls around him were blank, sterile, and unadorned. There were no paintings, no awards, no applause, just the sound of his own breathing. Outside, rain began to fall. Over Manhattan again, the same rain that had washed the alley on Bleecker Street in 1978. History had come full circle. And somewhere, far beyond the noise, Nora Kowalski's name echoed once more through the city that had tried to forget her now spoken not as tragedy, but as truth. Winter settled over New York with a kind of stillness that felt earned. The city, so used to noise and motion, paused long enough to watch its reflection in the glass towers of justice. The name August van der Molen had transformed from a symbol of prestige to a courtroom headline. And as the calendar turned toward the trial date, anticipation tightened around the city like a drawn breath. The courthouse on Center Street became a theater of contradictions: science versus influence, truth versus reputation, justice versus legacy. Inside the courtroom, the air carried that specific heaviness of cases where power meets consequence. Rows of reporters filled the benches, their pens moving like clockwork. Behind them sat families of other victims from long, cold cases, people who saw in Nora's name a spark of their own lost hope. On one side sat the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rena Ortiz, known for her calm, razor-sharp precision. The evidence she carried wasn't circumstantial, it was molecular. She opened with a single, steady line. DNA doesn't lie. It only waits. Projected on the screen behind her was the forensic timeline, each decade, each failed attempt, leading to that single moment when science finally caught up to 1978. The defense, in contrast, built its case around doubt, the oldest weapon of the powerful. August's attorney, a high-profile defender of corporate elites, argued that degradation, contamination, and chain of custody lapses made the DNA evidence unreliable. He painted August as a victim of technology, a man unfairly judged by machines rather than people. To his wealthy supporters, this argument resonated. They whispered about unfair targeting, about digital witch hunts, about science replacing justice. But the data didn't waver. Forensic experts testified that the match was absolute. The blood trace on the cufflink and the skin cells beneath Nora's fingernails both led to one man. The odds of an error were statistically non-existent. In that moment, the courtroom felt smaller, like everyone inside it had just realized that numbers could carry as much weight as testimony. The prosecution's narrative was simple but devastating. A 21-year-old law student, intoxicated by his own privilege, had confronted a young woman who refused him. In the struggle that followed, he killed her, tore free, and left behind the one symbol of who he truly was, a lion head cufflink clutched in the hand of the girl who refused to be erased. Every photograph shown in court, the alley, the cufflink, the microscope image of DNA strands, became another nail in the coffin of the illusion that power protects innocence. Public reaction was electric. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily with candles, signs, and Nora's photograph printed on posters. Across television panels and online discussions, debates erupted over privilege, accountability, and the reach of forensic science. One evening, an anchor summarized it best. For decades, influence was stronger than evidence. Now, the balance has shifted. The trial became more than a case. It became a reckoning. In homes across New York, Nora's story resurfaced, her photographs rediscovered, her art school friends interviewed, her surviving cousin, Elara Popescu, quietly becoming the moral anchor of the city. She never sought attention, but when asked to speak outside the courthouse, she delivered a statement that silenced even the loudest crowd. He lived his life like the truth was optional. Nora never had that luxury. The truth is all she has left, and it's finally being heard. Her words became the soul of the trial. As the proceedings stretched into the following weeks, more witnesses took the stand. Technicians described the FGGS process in exacting detail. Detectives recounted how genealogy had led them down a family line hidden behind privilege. Each piece reinforced the same inescapable point: justice delayed, but not denied. Even August's once loyal social circle began to fracture. Charities distanced themselves, foundations erased his name, and board members resigned in embarrassment. The facade of benevolence cracked completely, revealing the decay beneath. And through it all, August remained calm. He rarely spoke, except to correct a date or clarify a question. But every silence of his felt heavy, less like dignity, more like defeat. Lieutenant Quinlan Vesper, sitting quietly behind the prosecution table, kept her focus on the facts. For her, this wasn't triumph. It was proof that persistence mattered. She had taken the torch passed down by those before her, by Beck, by Elara, and used science to illuminate what time had buried. After one session, a journalist asked her if she believed in closure. She answered without hesitation, "There's no such thing as closure. Only continuity. We pick up where others stop." Those words echoed the unspoken truth of every cold case. Justice doesn't expire. It just waits for the right hands to find it. When the trial finally neared its end, the city held its breath again. Prosecutor Ortiz gave her closing argument under the gaze of packed galleries and rolling cameras. She spoke not with theatrics, but with quiet conviction. This case isn't about wealth or fame or the decades between 1978 and today. It's about a young woman who believed her life mattered. It's about the idea that the truth, no matter how small, endures. And sometimes, it takes half a century to listen. No one moved as she pointed to the photograph of Nora's hand clutching the lion head cufflink. She held the proof in her palm. And today, that proof speaks louder than privilege ever could. Outside, under the sharp winter light, Elara stood again near the courthouse steps. The skyline rose behind her, the same skyline Nora had once photographed, the same city that had taken and now returned her name. She watched the clouds drift past the mirrored towers, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. She fought back Elara whispered. She always did. The city exhaled. That evening, the courthouse lights dimmed, but the conversations didn't. Across televisions, phones, and kitchen tables, people spoke the same quiet realization that truth, though patient, never loses its way home. And somewhere, in a police archive drawer marked Closed 1978, a brass cufflink rested at last, no longer a secret, but a symbol of what justice looks like when it finally wakes. New York never stops moving. Its skyline shifts, its streets evolve, its faces change. But beneath all that motion, the city keeps its memories quietly, patiently, like light captured on undeveloped film. The story of Nora Kowalski became one of those memories. For nearly half a century, she existed only as an unanswered question in a file drawer. Yet, when science caught up to her courage, that question became an answer, and that answer became a legacy. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, the courtroom didn't erupt, it exhaled. There were no cheers, no dramatic outbursts, just a stillness that felt like peace finally settling into its rightful place. Outside, cameras waited, the night thick with snow and silence. Elara Popescu, standing under the courthouse steps, didn't celebrate. She just looked up at the lighted windows and whispered, "It's done." It wasn't triumph. It was truth. Because this case wasn't only about punishment, it was about remembrance. About proving that justice might sleep, but truth has a memory strong enough to wake it. In the weeks that followed, the story transcended headlines. Universities studied it, criminal justice programs discussed it, as the defining example of persistence meeting progress. Documentaries chronicled the decades-long pursuit. True crime forums buzzed with renewed faith in cold case work. But beyond the science and the spectacle, what lingered most was Nora herself, her art, her laughter, her light. Her old photographs were displayed in a small exhibit curated by students at City College. The title, "The Girl Who Saw Everything." Grainy black and white images filled the walls, street vendors, subway musicians, lovers caught mid-laughter. Viewers described the exhibit as haunting but hopeful, like seeing New York through eyes that never stopped noticing. Each photo told the same story. She wanted the truth to be seen, and in the end, it was. From analog photography to digital forensics, Nora's journey mirrored the evolution of truth itself. In 1978, her weapon was a camera, an instrument of light, framing the world's imperfections in silver and shadow. In 2024, her savior was DNA sequencing, an instrument of data decoding the silent language written inside every cell. Two technologies, born from curiosity and precision, connected across generations to complete a single act of justice. It's poetic, in a way. A photographer's eye and a scientist's microscope, both tools meant to reveal what hides beneath the surface. Nora's story proved that progress isn't just measured by technology. It's measured by empathy, endurance, and the quiet refusal to let time erase meaning. Detective Silas Beck didn't live to see the verdict. He passed a few months before the trial began. But in the NYPD cold case unit, a small brass plaque was mounted above his old case file drawer. For those who keep the promise, even when the world stops listening. Lieutenant Quinlan Vesper made sure his name was the first to be engraved. She often said that Beck's persistence taught her what every investigator should remember, that justice isn't fast, but it's faithful. Elara became the soul of the city's reflection. She didn't attend interviews anymore, didn't stand before cameras, but every August 12th, she still visited the alley on Bleecker Street. It looked different now. Renovated, lit, safe, but she could still feel the echo. She'd place a single lily near the brick wall and whisper, "You can rest now." And though no one was there to hear her, the city itself seemed to pause for her words. One evening, months after the trial, a tribute illuminated the courthouse facade, a projection of Nora's photographs, fading in and out like a reel of memory. Each image shimmered across the marble steps, children playing near hydrants, rain-slicked streets, faces of strangers who'd once passed her lens, At the end of the montage appeared a single line. "She fought back. She always did." The crowd gathered quietly in the cold. Phones stayed lowered. For a few minutes, there were no debates, no noise, only the collective recognition that one young woman's defiance had outlived her years. Across social media, the story reached far beyond New York. It became a universal parable of persistence. Families of missing persons wrote that it gave them hope. Scientists cited it as evidence that technology could restore faith in truth. Even within police departments, it changed perspectives. Cold case units in other states began reopening decades-old files, inspired by Nora's case, to believe that forgotten evidence might still whisper if given another chance. But the deeper message wasn't just about investigation or justice. It was about human endurance, about the idea that memory itself can be a rebellion. Because the city tried to move on. Time tried to fade her name. But people like Alara, Beck, and eventually Vesper refused to let that happen. In their persistence, Nora became more than a victim. She became a symbol, a reminder that truth doesn't vanish. It waits. The final archive update on her case file was short. Closed. Conviction obtained via forensic genealogy. Victim identified as Nora Kowalski. Justice achieved. End quote. 1 CR. W2 SEG 0%. But the word closed felt wrong. The story wasn't closed. It had simply evolved into education, into remembrance, into something permanent. A generation of criminologists now referenced the Kowalski case as a turning point in cold case methodology. But for the city, it became something more personal, a mirror reflecting both its darkness and its redemption. Years later, on a quiet evening, a visitor standing at Washington Square Park might still see a small memorial tucked into the bookstore wall near where Nora once worked. A photograph of her camera rests in a glass box. Beneath it, a brass plaque reads, "She captured truth. It captured her back." Below that, in smaller text, the city added a final inscription, the same words that would later echo through every true crime documentary, every tribute video, and every person who whispered her story to someone new, is greater than. In a city of millions, one red-haired girl refused to be forgotten, and because she held on, so did justice. Every story leaves something behind. A sound, a scar, a shadow. For some, it's an unanswered question. For others, it's a reminder that truth will always find its way through the dark. And if you've stayed with us through Nora's story tonight, remember, keeping these stories alive means keeping justice alive. If you're watching this right now, you've kept her story breathing. You've proven that remembrance itself is power. Every view, every comment, every moment you've spent listening ensures that voices like Nora's will never fade again. Because as long as we remember, the truth stays awake.